So tonight's special. I've been wanting to get Dr. Alison Preston to do one of these for a while. She's very busy because she's so talented. But we have her tonight to talk about memory and adolescence, and as opposed to, in contrast to adults. So Allie is recently now promoted to full professor in the Department of Neuroscience and in the Department of Psychology. She's also director of the Imaging Center, which is now named something else. Something with imaging in it. She's the director of that. More important than all of that, she really is one of our superstars. She's one of the world's authorities on using imaging techniques to try to understand what happens in our brains when we learn. She's been highly innovative and discovered many things. And what we're going to hear about tonight is that a while back she decided to turn that talent towards asking questions about the differences between the way adults learn and the way children and adolescents learn. And so join me in welcoming Allie Preston.
Well, thank you all for coming out tonight. It's a pleasure to be here. I always like to give these talks because, you know, I sit in my lab and I do my science with my talented crew. But it's great to come out and give talks like this to really see the impact of the basic things that we do and how they actually might influence people's real lives. And so today I'm going to hopefully tell you about some basic science that might actually influence our understanding of how kids and teens learn and therefore maybe better educated. So we all heard this adage, right? With age comes wisdom, and I think we all kind of agree with this. What I'm going to talk about today is, are children's brains ready to be wise, right? So when we think about what wisdom is, right, as scientists, we always like to operationalize our definitions of the terms that we use. So what do you guys think wisdom is? Judgment, learning, experience, understanding, fairness. These are all great things. So the way I conceive of it, which kind of shares some characteristics with what you guys think, is that, of course, wisdom is accumulated over time, right? It doesn't emerge immediately. We need to have experiences. And it's derived, right? It's derived from what we experience. We don't directly acquire wisdom. We have to, right, accumulate it through the many things that we experience. And how we use wisdom, right, we use it to make predictions and guide our decisions. So our collective experience allows us to decide how to act and behave in situations both in the present as well as projecting ourselves into the future, right? And so that's how I conceive of wisdom. And this is a quote from a British satirist, right? So the other way to think about it is knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit, but wisdom is knowing not to put it in a fruit salad, right? So that's a nice way to conceptualize wisdom, right? And so again, right, so of course, there's one part of this that children, of course, are going to be less wise because they've had less accumulated experience. But what I'm going to argue today is actually it's more than that, right? Their brains function in a different way from adults that actually might make it more difficult for them to acquire wisdom in the way that adult brains are ready to be wise. And so before we kind of get to the meat of this question, we have to think about, first, how do we actually study children's brains, right? And so as Mike alluded to, I direct the Biomedical Imaging Center here at UT Austin. And so, you know, imaging science has really been around for about 3 or 4 decades now. And this allows us a non-invasive way to study the human brain. And so here's a scanner, right? You've probably seen things like this in the hospital. And so we use these scanners, and our participants, kids, can come in, and we slide them into the scanner, and we can measure their brain activation. It's actually an indirect measure of brain activity. So we measure changes in blood flow while they're doing various learning and memory tasks, right? And this can tell us a lot about how their brains are operating and how they might differ from teenage brains or from adult brains. And so, you know, there's some kids in the audience here, but even you adults, we take many participants. So Google our lab, or write down this URL. We are actively looking for participants all the time, and so you can participate in one of these studies if you like. So we put people in these scanners and we have them do tasks so we can measure their brain activation. And that's most of the kind of the data I'm going to talk to you about today, is how we use that data to actually learn about how the brain develops, right? So what are some kind of general adages or principles about brain development that we've learned using these kind of imaging techniques? So one is that, sorry, I keep hitting the wrong buttons. I think I'm too far away. Okay, so one thing that we know is that the brain's lines of communication actually develop over a very long period of time. So what do you think I mean by lines of communication? Yeah, so we know that neurons or brain cells, they have kind of the meat of them, the cell bodies, and then they have these long projection called axons. And so the cell bodies make up the gray matter, right? You've all heard of brain gray matter. These axons, or these lines of communication, are what make up the white matter of the brain, right? And so these communication lines, or the white matter of the brain, actually develops over a long period of time. So this is actually a rendering of a 5-year-old's brain. So this is the front of their head and the back of the brain. And so this is a top-down view of the same brain. So this is the front and this is the back. And so this color scale just represents how mature these white matter is, or the communication lines at this particular age. So red is pretty immature, and as we get into the blue and purple scale, it's more mature. So here's a lot of blue here, right, kind of the middle, and here's some blue here. What do you think matures first? What do you think these brain regions might do that are more mature early in life, like at the age of 5? Vision, so that's right. So that's the occipital lobe back here is very important for vision. This happens to be somatosensory, so our feelings of touch and mechano sensation, and motor function are the other regions that are here blue. So those mature, this kind of basic functions that we need very early on. The wiring of the brain, or the communication lines there, develop earliest. So this here, this red region, what do you guys think that does? Thinking, that's the frontal lobe. So this is the more complex kind of cognitive processes are observed by the frontal lobe, and so those are the brain regions that develop last. So this is a 5-year-old, and we can look at these renderings at different ages. So here we have preteen, like around the ages of 10. We have a teenage brain, and we have a 20-year-old brain. And so what you can see is that the brain's communications line actually are developing all the way into the 3rd decade of life. And even this 20-year-old brain isn't fully mature, right? This is all blue rather than purple. And so really the human brain actually reaches kind of peak maturation around the age of 24 or 25. So even college students' brains aren't fully developed. And so that's important to think about when we think about learning and memory. So that's one way the brain, right, develops, is kind of the way that these projections from one region to the other, or within a given brain region talk to another, they mature over time. The gray matter, right, of different regions, so that kind of the cell bodies within a brain cell, also develop over time. And so I'll focus today on these memory centers. So I'm going to talk a lot about the hippocampus, which is a structure in the middle part of the brain. Here it's in purple. And I'll just briefly mention the prefrontal cortex too. Both of these regions also develop all the way through adolescence and into the 3rd decade of life. So we can use imaging to measure kind of structural changes, so we can use these pictures of, this is a child's brain, and so here's the hippocampus right here in this box, and this is just a blow up showing all the different parts of the hippocampus. And so we can just look at something as simple as the size of these regions and how it changes over the course of development. And so that's what I'm showing here, is the size of this region is a function of age, and you see these kind of curvilinear, like developmental courses in many parts of the brain. So you kind of increasing size through adolescence and then decreasing size through adulthood. And so what people think this actually corresponds to is what's known as proliferation. So there's a lot of proliferation and the connections between different brain cells that happen in childhood through adolescence, and then adolescence represents this characteristic pruning period where thousands and thousands of brain cell connections actually are pruned through adolescence to kind of refine the way the brain works over time. And you see that not only in the hippocampus, but other regions like the prefrontal cortex. And these are 2 regions that are very important for learning and memory. So again, the brain, both its wiring and the way these individual structures are comprised, are maturing for over a very long period of time. And so this suggests that children's and teens' brains really may not be wired in a way, they may not be ready to pick up kind of wisdom over time. And so we know that learning and memory abilities improve all the way through adulthood, so simple things like remembering how things are related to one another or associations between experiences. Children get better at retrieving what they've experienced all the way through adolescence. There's a particular growth of this ability during middle childhood, so during grammar school. As I'll talk about a lot today, children and teens are less likely to make connections between different events that they've experienced. So if they learn information at different points of time, they're not likely to make connections, even if they share kind of principles and properties. And so that's what I'll talk a lot about today. I mean, what this means, like these growth of these general learning and memory abilities and this ability to kind of connect or link memories across time, not only has an impact on learning and memory itself, but also decision making, right? So it impacts children's ability to reason and make decisions in novel circumstances, right? So if don't have an intact memory system, you can't make wise or rational, right, decisions is the idea here. Okay, so right, to give you kind of a framework to think about how brains develop and how they might become wise over time, we first have to think about how adults use their memory to become wise. And so I like to use this kind of real-world example to talk about our laboratory tasks. So imagine that you're leaving your house or your apartment and you're on your way to work one day, and this gentleman is leaving the house next door, and maybe that house was recently for sale or for rent, and he's leaving and he's walking his dog, and you might think, oh, that guy must be my new neighbor, right? And so this particular experience, it has a lot of different facets to it, different sights, sounds, smells, thoughts, feelings that you have. And all of those things are processed in different parts of the brain, and they kind of get bound together and represented in some sort of neural or brain code, right? And so here I'll just talk about the simple relationship between the man and the dog. And imagine a couple weeks later, you're taking a walk through a park, and you see this woman walking the dog, right? And so here we have a piece of information that is shared across these two experiences. And the idea here is that no learning event actually occurs in isolation from one another. We often have experienced things that share a lot of content. And so this content can lead you to retrieve memories, right? So you might reactivate or reinstate the previous experience, right? You might think about when you saw that dog before, right, in your neighborhood being walked by this man. And so as a function of doing that, when you're learning about the new event, like when you're forming a memory for this woman walking the dog in the park, you actually might store that as an overlapping representation in your brain, right? And the power of that kind of code, it allows you to form links between experiences that you don't directly observe, right? So you not only form a relationship in your brain that the man goes with the dog and the woman goes with the dog, those are things that we see together, but you also form a connection between this woman and the man, that they share a relationship, and perhaps also the woman with the house next door to you, right? And so in retrieving these memories and forming these overlapping codes, it allows us to form knowledge that goes beyond direct experience. And that's very powerful because that knowledge can serve as predictions about these future events. So let's say that you had a piece of mail that that's been misdelivered to your house. You might know that you can return it to either the man or the woman, even though that you've never seen the woman in your neighborhood at the house next door, right? So that's kind of flexible, kind of wise, rational decision making that these kind of representations might support, right? And so our lab has done a lot to look at this in adults, right, to kind of set the framework for our developmental studies. And so we can ask how people learn, right, how they use memory structures in order to make these reasoning decisions about the fact that the man might share a relationship with the woman. And so really to do that, we actually want to measure what people are remembering as we're teaching about these new things. So can we actually show evidence that people are reactivating their previous experiences during these new learning events? And what consequence does that have for their learning and reasoning ability? So I'm going to tell you about our laboratory version of this man-woman-dog example. So we give people a task much like this, where they learn simple associations between visual pictures. So here, they might see this cake, and it's paired with a picture of a stapler, right? So that's what I'm calling this initial pair here. And then they might see another pair, a speedboat with a wagon, which doesn't share any features of this initial event. And then later in time, they might see the stapler again, but this time it's paired with a face. In this case, it's Aladdin, a cartoon character, because as you'll see, we also use the same task in children and adolescents. And so the idea here is that we have these two overlapping episodes, much like the man and the dog and the woman and the dog, right? That's the analogy here. And so the first time they see the cake and the stapler, right, they haven't yet seen this overlapping information about Aladdin, right? So we're not going to, they wouldn't be thinking about anything else, right? They're just learning about the cake and the stapler is the idea. But in these kind of experiments, we repeat these episodes so that they see this cake and the stapler again. And so what do you guys think might happen here? They'll think about Aladdin, right? That's the idea. It's like we're going to think about see if the people think about Aladdin while they see the cake and the stapler on the second time, right? So, and we repeat these events, these overlapping events again, and then we do it all again a third time. And so the idea is that you can see this increasing reactivation of Aladdin during these cake and the stapler trials, right? And so we want to first measure that out and relate it to how people reason. So how they reason about the fact that the cake and Aladdin might be related to one another even though they've never seen them at the same time, right? Same idea as the man, woman, dog, right? Okay, so that's what we have people do. We also have them look at just individual objects and pictures of individual faces because we're actually going to use some techniques from computer science, machine learning algorithms to actually decode what they're thinking about as they're seeing the cake and the stapler. So we can take patterns of brain activation that we measure while we're doing these imaging experiments, and we can train, uh-oh. No, I don't know what happened. There we go. Aha, maybe. Okay. So we actually teach nope. We teach a computer, I'll keep talking and it'll be, wait until Steve gets back. So we teach these computer algorithms. So we give the computer algorithms our patterns of brain data, and we train it to recognize the pattern of brain activation that somebody exhibits when they're viewing a face, and the pattern of brain activation that somebody exhibits when they're viewing an object. And we can differentiate between those states, right? Because it turns out people's brains tend to process that kind of information differently, right? So we train this neural algorithm to recognize when people are viewing objects or viewing faces. Cool? All right. So I'll keep going. So the idea is that we can then take the data for when they're viewing the cake and the stapler, right? And we can take this algorithm and we can classify, we can test and look for face activation when people are viewing the cake and the stapler. And we can relate the degree that we're thinking about Aladdin to their ability to reason or perform a subsequent inference task using on the relationship between Aladdin and the cake, right? That's the idea. And so I'll have to wait now to show you the data. Yay. Right, so that's the idea, right? So we're going to look for reactivation of this related information and relate it to their ability to make these reasoning decisions about the fact that the cake shares a relationship with Aladdin. And so this is what adults show. So what I'm plotting here's just the repetitions of the cake and the stapler, the first, the second, and the third time that they see it. And this is activation from our neural classifier about when they're thinking about Aladdin. So the first time they see the cake and the stapler, they're not thinking about it, right? They shouldn't. But then these second and third repetitions, we see the evidence that they're thinking about Aladdin as they're actually learning about this overlapping information. And if we look about how much they're reactivating this information as a function of the performance on these reasoning tasks, we see that the people who reactivate Aladdin the most do the best at this task. So each of these dots is a person in our experiment. And so the idea here is that people who actually reactivate this content link these related memories as they're learning them, and that leads them to be faster and more accurate at these reasoning decisions. So these kind of fundamental memory processes that allow us to connect these different events during learning makes us better at these kind of novel decisions. So that's what happens in adults, right? And so, tonight I'm focusing mostly on these reasoning tasks, but these memory linking abilities, like making connections between these disparate learning experiences, also supports many other kind of cognitive abilities that we have. So they allow us to acquire concepts and categories. It's a really important part of our ability to navigate our environments, right? You imagine that you have a pretty decent map of Austin in your head, but you've never always traveled every street contiguously. You help build a map of a neighborhood over time through all of your individual experiences driving through that neighborhood. It allows us to make new decisions like reasoning. And it's also thought to be essential to imagination and creativity. So making these novel connections might support our ability to come up with really novel solutions to problems in ways that go beyond what the world shows us. But we'll stick with reasoning for tonight. And so we can now move to thinking about whether children and teens actually do the same thing, right? Do they use their existing knowledge to help them make connections between different learning events, and how does that relate to their reasoning ability? So we give the same task to children, and so these are children ages 6 to 12, and these are adolescents from 13 to 17. And so what you can see here is that the light bars are how they're doing on these kind of inferential reasoning tasks. And what you see is that children and adolescents don't do as well on these kind of inference tasks, and it's actually disproportional to the amount of knowledge that they can acquire in the first place. So they do pretty well at learning about these individual associations, but they don't do very well at making the connections between them in terms of behavior, right? But the question is, what's going on in their brains? So we give them the same task. Again, we have cake and stapler repeated 3 times. And so the first time they see it, this is the children group. The darker gray bars are the adolescents, and the adults are replotted here. No one shows significant activation of Aladdin, right, during that first repetition, and they shouldn't. On the second repetition, what you see is the teens and the adults do, so that you start seeing evidence that they're thinking about Aladdin as they're learning these overlapping experiences. What's really interesting is that on the third time they see the cake and the stapler, only the adults show this kind of sustained reactivation. The teens, it falls back to close to 0. So what this shows is the children don't link memories, right? They're not thinking about Aladdin at all as they're learning about these overlapping experiences. The adolescents do something different, right? They actually might actively suppress related memories. So they reactivate Aladdin at first, but maybe it's too much competition, right? They don't know how to deal with it. And so the third time they see it, they actually don't reactivate it at all. So we see this kind of different patterns of brain responses across these different developmental timescales. And what this might mean for this reasoning task is that if, when doing these kinds of decisions, when thinking about which of these cartoon characters goes with the cake, a child might have to reason from the individual episodes that they experience. They know the cake goes with the stapler, and they know the stapler goes with Aladdin, and then they have to do this more effortful process of kind of manipulating them online at the time of test, which is going to make them slower, and it's going to make them less accurate in the end. Whereas an adult, right, they've had the opportunity to combine these by thinking about Aladdin when they're learning about the cake and the stapler. They form this kind of linked memory. And so when given the inference task, they don't have to reason about the individual episodes. They already have this direct connection between Aladdin and the cake, and so they can be faster and more accurate at these kind of decisions, right? So again, these very simplistic memory phenomena might play a really critical role in how our ability to reason about our worlds develops through time, right? And so one thing I want to emphasize is that we see a different kind of response in the teens' brain. So they reactivate this information at first, and then they don't, right? And one idea that we don't know a lot about, but it's an interesting theme that I'm really interested in, is that teens' brains might be particularly wired for exploration, right? The idea is that in the task I just showed you, they might be suppress prior experience on purpose, right? And that when they're learning about new content, and that just might be because they want to gather as much data about their worlds as possible. The adolescent brain or the teen brain might be particularly important time for learning, right? And so there's other data from animal work from not my lab, but another lab where they used a rodent model of learning. And so how many of you guys know what conditioning is? Yeah, a lot of you. So this is a model of memory that uses what's called contextual fear conditioning. So you might stick this lovely rat in this chamber, and that when they're in this chamber, they receive a shock, right? So they learn to associate this particular environment with this aversive experience, right? And that's a very common model of memory. So they did this in actually rats of different ages, so some that were kid rats and some that were teen rats and adult rats. And they wanted to see, so they taught them this response and they froze, right? So that's the measure of memory here, is that they learn to freeze when they're in this context. And so they gave them this initial experience, and they all learned it initially, but then they waited a few days and they gave them a test. And the test is basically just to stick them back in this same chamber, this box, and not give them a shock and see what they do, right? And so what happens in the kid rats is that they continue to freeze, right? So they remember that this context is associated with this aversive experience. The adults do the same thing, right? So they also, right, freeze. What's interesting is that the teenage rats didn't do so after this delay. They explore this environment, just this, as if there is nothing aversive that happens in this. Now, that's interesting, right? You might think, well, maybe the teens just forgot, right? Right? Could be. Those of you who have teens might think that. But what's really interesting is just by happenstance, not on purpose, they happen to stick these teenage rats back in this chamber when they were adults. And when they did that, they froze. Right? So it's not that they forgot that original experience. What they showed is actually through these memory structures is that memory that this context was associated with shock was actually suppressed at this point in time. It wasn't erased, it was just temporarily suppressed, but it was there to retrieve once they reached adulthood, right? So again, it's very similar to the experiment I showed you with the cake and the stapler and Aladdin, right? So, and again, we'd argue that, right, this idea is that they're just, instead of exploiting what they already know about the world, right, to make decisions and decide what to do in an environment, they're just gathering more data. They want to explore their environments and learn as much as they can, right? And so that's it might be what actually promotes risky behavior in teenagers, right? They're not actually really using what they know to make, right, the optimal decisions all the time, right? Just because they're trying to explore. So that's kind of the negative aspect of this particular thing. But others have shown, and I'm not going to talk about this data today, that this might actually represent an optimal state for learning, right? The idea is that suppressing what you know just allows you to learn as much as possible, right? So it has this negative consequence, but overall it's very adaptive, right? Because it's such an essential part of life, right? Okay, so, and I'll just emphasize that this is, again, very different, right? So children and even teens have different learning systems, right? Just because of the way that their brains are wired at the different ages. And they might reflect different, there might be optimal ways to teach kids and teens about information as a result. Okay, so one more general principle about what these kind of findings showed us is something that I kind of like to refer to as like the specificity versus generalization trade-off, right? So let me make that more clear with a more real-world example. So, how many parents do we have in the room? A lot. I'm sure you remember when your children are little, how many birthday parties you had to go to, right? A lot of birthday parties. And children, they go to a lot of birthday parties, and here are a few instances of birthday parties. And what might be happening is children and teens form these very specific memories for birthday parties. They remember all the details associated with each one, but they kind of treat them in isolation from one another, right? Just like we saw with the cake and the stapler and Aladdin. Adults tend to form these more fuzzy or gist-based memories. So you might have some sort of general birthday schema, right? So you're not necessarily focused on the details, but you know there's usually a cake, and there's usually some games, and there's usually screaming involved. And in my day and age, we actually opened the presents at the parties, but that doesn't happen anymore. But the idea here is that there's these more fuzzy memories. So to make this kind of more explicit, right? So let's imagine that, my son, this isn't a picture of my son's in the audience actually, but let's say my son had a birthday party and he really wanted to have a birthday party with superheroes, and he dressed up as Thor, and we had this guy who came and dressed as Captain America, right? The idea is that children and teens might form a very specific memory for what all the costumes their friends wore, what the superhero did, what they did in what order, right? And kind of all this detailed content. Whereas me, right, I might, because I have such, been to a lot of birthday parties, when I'm at this new birthday party, I might not focus on the kind of things I already know are going to happen, like when the cape came. I might remember what the costume is that my kid wore, because I had to buy it, and he really liked Thor at that particular point in time. But the rest of it would be kind of fuzzy. And so the idea is that, in some ways, children and teens' brains actually might be more accurate and better at resolving the details of memories that we experience, and adults' brains are more fuzzy. But the idea here is these kind of fuzzy representations allow for a lot of generalization, right? When I go to a new birthday party, I can predict what's going to happen based on all the birthday parties that I've ever been to. And children, they're less likely to do that, right? And so that's why I call this the specificity versus generalization trade-off. So early in life, we have very specific kind of individuated memories. And later in life, we start to form these more general representations that are really adaptive because they're maximally predictive. They cover most of the scenarios most of the time, but they might not be as good at resolving specific details. Okay? So that's one of these kind of general principles. So without this, without memory linking, you can't form these kind of representations, right? You can't extract what a birthday party schema is unless you're making these different connections at the time. And so because children and teens aren't doing that, they might fail to have these more kind of generalizable representations. But, right, what's the cost here, right? So there must be a cost. So children may be more accurate, and teens may be more accurate than adults at memories. And that actually is what people find, is that you see false memories, right? Endorsing things that you didn't experience actually increases with age. So those generalized representations are really predictive, but they often lead to false predictions, is the idea. And so that's the negative flip side of that coin. So here, right, going to our birthday party example, again, the kids might remember what all their best friends, when I ask them to recall this birthday party from 6 months ago, they'll be able to tell me what everybody wore and who the guy was, the character, the adult character we had come to visit, right? They'll be able to tell me it was Captain America, so which superhero came to the party, and the kid might say Captain America, whereas me, right, I form this more generalized representation, and I might be able to tell you what my kid wore, but I might get confused, right, about the character. Maybe I confuse him with Iron Man because this other kid was wearing this Iron Man costume. And so because I've had this fuzzier memory, I might be more likely to falsely endorse having experienced this. And so, we can go back to my original kind of toy example. Is we could ask again, where did you first meet this woman? So a child, right, might accurately remember that they experienced this woman in the park, right? The first time they saw this woman walking the dog was in the park. Whereas an adult, because we form this kind of representation that the woman shares a relationship with the man and might share a relationship with the house next door, basically when forming a new memory for this thing, it's been embedded in the original memory. So when asked at a later point in time, where did you first meet this woman, you might actually say that I actually met her in my neighborhood. Of course, she's my new neighbor, right? And you might not remember the context correctly. And this isn't indeed what adults tend to do. So they tend to endorse more of these false experiences, which have it's not like they're inaccurate, but they're just not as precise, right, as children's memories might be. Okay, so that's all I'm going to talk to you guys about in detail, but some take-home messages, right, about this kind of line of research. So we construct knowledge by linking the experiences that we have across time, and we do that by through retrieving or recalling these memories when we're learning about new things. And that these memory linking supports the kind of novel decision-making and reasoning abilities, right? forming and extracting these knowledge is what might support kind of wise decision making, right? Thinking about and exploiting what you already know to make the optimal decisions in any given new circumstance. And that there might be developmental limits in terms of neural function or brain function to children's and teens' ability to link memories across time, thus making them less accurate at reasoning decisions. But it might also relate to the fact that things like conceptual knowledge acquisition, again, develops over a long time. Spatial memory, so children's ability to navigate their environments, develops all the way at least through the age of 12 and possibly later. So there's many different kind of basic phenomena that might be related to these memory linking abilities. And so these kind of simple toy examples I've given you might actually represent a really fundamental process about how the brain works and reveals limitations about what children and teens are actually able to learn about their environments. And I'll again emphasize that children and teens might not be a continuum. It's not like brains get better as they age. There's a little bit of that, for sure. But that the teenage years might be particularly wired to do something different than even children's brains do, to really explore their environments. And they might suppress, right, again, things that they've experienced in order to do that, which again has negative consequences, but positive consequences for the amount that they can learn and how fast they can learn it during that period of time. So these are kind of some take-home messages from the basic science, and why we do this, like what are the real-world applications of this kind of information? So we do, interestingly, there's not a lot of labs that's in the world that study learning and memory using neural techniques. Mine is one of maybe a half dozen in the world that actually scans people's brains doing these kinds of tasks. And I think that's a fundamental problem, right? Because we really should know how children and teens' brains work in order to develop the educational strategies that are going to be most effective to teach those individuals at that age, right? And how we teach a 6-year-old child might require different strategies than how we teach a 14-year-old teen, right? And so I think there's some interesting possibilities to intersect education and neuroscience, even through these kind of basic insights that we've formed. One thing I didn't talk about a lot, but many neurodevelopmental disorders and actually a lot of mental health disorders have developmental onsets. Of course, autism and dyslexia are childhood disorders, but schizophrenia often has childhood onsets, anxiety disorders often, and depression can emerge in adolescence in particular. And all of these particular disorders actually have been linked to aberrant function of these memory systems. So again, understanding kind of these basic mechanisms about how the brain works in typical development can give us insights and maybe to where these things might go a little bit wrong in these particular clinical disorders. So it's again, it might give us insights about how we can intervene in those particular disorders. And one interesting point that I always like to emphasize is that as a neuroscientist, I really think we should be studying individuals across the lifespan, and to the degree that we can, track individuals across their entire life. So we do a little bit of work with older, of course we do adult work, but we're starting to do older adults in my lab as well. But what's really interesting is that brain function actually in early life often predicts how you age. So the experiences that you have, right, your background genetics, but also how your brain is wired and the things that influence brain wiring early in life are highly predictive of whether you're going to age in a healthy manner or perhaps age in a less healthy manner. So this is, again, emphasizes that we should view neural development as a continuum across the lifespan, and really understanding what kids do actually might give us insights into healthy aging as well. And so with that, I'll thank you guys for your attention, and I'd just like to thank all of my lab members and, of course, the generous funding from all these various agencies who help support this kind of science. So thank you.